My name is Biber, and I have the honor of hosting this evening. This is the next in our series, Dining Plus Design, and it's entitled Expo Milano, US Pavilion, American Food 2.0. Our series, Dining Plus Design, is co-sponsored by the James Beard Foundation and the New School's Food Studies Department. Now, I have to put in a plug about food studies. This is necessary. We offer a variety of courses open to the public. All of them are open to the public. And they range over a variety of topics related to food and food policy. For instance, next semester we're offering American Culinary History. Then there's a course, Feasting Your Eyes, Food and Film. There's Intro to Food Design, We Eat What We Are. And then there's Food Fight. So you get to name courses. They're fun when you're talking about food. But Food Fight is serious, the role of food in advocacy and socio-political communication. We're also really proud to announce that as of fall 2014, we will have food studies majors for BA and BS undergraduates, and we also have currently minors in food studies. We are developing a food design minor with Parsons, the New School for Design. And we're actually in the process of working on a food studies program in Paris, at Parsons in Paris. So there's a lot of things. Yeah, we're all playing. No, we're all wangling for that. But unfortunately, right now, there's only the chair is traveling back and forth. So I want you to encourage you to visit our blog, The Inquisitive Eater, which has a wide variety of pieces that we publish, and we do welcome any submissions from the public. So please, if you're interested in food and you have some ideas, please send your submission to The Inquisitive Eater. If you're interested in any other events at the New School, including those food-related, but a lot more because we offer a good many of them, just go outside when you're leaving and leave your name with the ladies at the table, and then you'll get regular notifications. You can also, of course, check the website. So now I want to introduce our two protagonists for this evening's dialogue, right? Two of these gentlemen have been very, very intimately related with the design of this pavilion at Expo Milano. So the first is James Biber, who is the architect for the project. James Biber has practiced architecture in a multidisciplinary environment for more than 25 years, including as a partner of the international design consultancy Pentagram. Trained first as a biologist, then as an architect, James has surrounded himself with a variety of thinkers from different fields to expand the notion of architecture. His work centers on a belief that architecture as an expression of identity is inseparable from its language of form and tectonics. The result is an architecture tied closely to its context, whether physical, cultural, or metaphorical. Biber's projects include the Harley-Davidson Museum in Milwaukee, private oceanfront homes in the Hamptons, CUNY's Macaulay Honors College, the nation's Millennium Time Capsule, dinnerware for Umbra, as well as New York City and national restaurants. Current work includes the galleries at the Koch Institute at MIT, the new Pizza Vinoteca restaurant off Union Square, Success Academy's new high school, the Brownsville Brooklyn Public Library, and a system of luxury houses in the Hamptons. His work has been recognized by the AIA, the AIGA, the SEGD, and other professional design organizations, lots of alphabet, and other professional organizations, and has been published in the New York Times, Architectural Record, the Wall Street Journal, Architecture, Blueprint, Wallpaper, Dwell, Metropolitan Home, and New York Magazine, to name just a few. And the Design Press internationally. So that's James Biber. Now, for the other participant is Mitchell Davis. Mitchell Davis is the Executive Vice President of the James Beard Foundation. He's a cookbook author, a food journalist, and a scholar with a PhD in food studies from NYU. With the Beard Foundation for 20 years, Davis has created and overseen many of the organization's important initiatives, including the James Beard Foundation Annual Food Conference, a national dialogue of thought leaders on sustainability and public health in the food system, and the James Beard Foundation Chef's Boot Camp for Policy and Change. In 2013, Davis led the team that was selected by the U.S. Department of State to create the US Pavilion at the World Expo Milano 2015, the theme of which is American Food 2.0. In addition to his work at the foundation, Davis frequently writes about and reviews restaurants. He holds a chair on the Academy of the London-based World's 50 Best Restaurants ranking program. He has written 4 cookbooks, including The Mensch Chef and The Kitchen Sense, both Clarkson Potter, co-authored the groundbreaking electronic book My Provence, Alta Editions, with famed French chef Laurent Gras, which won 2 2013 awards from the International Association of Culinary Professionals, including Judge's Choice, and he is a regular contributor to The Art of Eating. Davis's TV appearances include History Channel's 101 Fast Foods That Changed the World, Food Network's Foodobiography, Throwdown with Bobby Flay, and Best in Smoke. Davis has hosted Taste Matters, a weekly radio show, Wednesdays at 11 a.m. on the Heritage Radio Network. In 2013, the Forward selected Davis as one of the 50 most influential Jews under 50 in America.
And on this, the last night of Passover, that's particularly significant.
It's really important,
Yeah.
as a matter of fact. So let me welcome Mitchell Davis and James Biber, and they'll take over the conversation.
Thank you.
I'm afraid we're out of time.
Yeah, if someone could take a note for us to shorten those, we'll take that to heart. So thank you all for coming. We wanted to take an opportunity, and what better place than in the series that we co-collaborated on, called Dining and Design, to talk about this little project that the Beard Foundation and some of our other partners, the International Culinary Center, which is a culinary school that's based down in Soho, not far from here, but also has campuses in California, in Italy, soon in China, and I think also in Japan. And our friends, the American Chamber of Commerce in Italy, which is an organization obviously representing large American companies, who got together and created, or were let's say, needled into a position of participating in something that none of us really knew much about when we began. I'll start there. And I'm going to begin by telling a little bit of story of how we got to this point where about 3 weeks ago, President Obama and Secretary Kerry, while on their first official visit to Italy during Obama's presidency, announced that America was coming, in fact, to the next World's Fair. And Jim will explain all of the wonderful things that will happen or that have are part of the building and that will happen there. And so those of you probably do not know, many of you probably do not know that World's Fairs continue. Certainly we were not all aware. People remember 1964 if they were around in New York and they went 5 or 6 times with their families. Some people, if they were really international, remember 67 in Montreal, Expo 67, and then one might assume if you were here that they sort of fell off the face of the earth. And in fact, the World's Fairs have continued consistently from that point, certainly from 1851 right up until 2015, and 2020 has been announced to be in Dubai in the UAE. When we were approached, it was by the organizing committee of the Expo Milano, and we were the James Beard Foundation and ICC, and the reason we were approached wasn't to participate in the bid for the American Pavilion, but we were asked to help get America to participate, period. That at that time, 136 countries have agreed to be part of this World's Fair, but of course the one country that they wanted the most to be there was us, and of course it wasn't on anybody's radar, and we didn't know if we were going to do it, and certainly when they called, we had no idea that we could even influence such a thing. But we said, sure, why not? The Beard Foundation, as part of the programs that were lengthily described in my bio, we created this partnership with the State Department called the American Chef Corps, part of something called the Diplomatic Culinary Partnership, and it's a corps of 200 chefs who are sort of ambassadors when they travel abroad, many names you would recognize, some you wouldn't, but certainly representing a a broad swath of American culinary moment. And so we did what we would do, and we called those people and said, hey, we know you at the State Department. What do you know about Expo Milano? And the answer was absolutely nothing. What is it? And that's where the process began. That process, again, the whole time, us thinking that maybe this was an interesting thing, it began to grow into something much more interesting as we investigated the path that might lead to participation. The impetus for anything to happen was that for the first time in that 150-year history, the theme of the entire expo was going to be food. Now, you may all know food has always been an important part. Some of the many things that people remember, the first ice cream cone, the first Belgian waffle on American soil, all those sorts of things, lots of firsts at World's Fairs. But never before had the theme of the overarching fair, every country's participation, been food. That's what made us perk up and even answer the call and make that call to our friends at the State Department. What that would be and how that would play out, and what, at this point, all 148 countries might participate, what they might present in the context of the theme, which is feeding the planet, energy for life, was still unclear, and what America's contribution would be. But suddenly an idea started to grow. And over the course it was over a year it took us of calls and conversations and ideas and gathering people together to think about what an American pavilion could be on a global stage in Milan, in the heart of Europe. I would say the attraction of doing something grew. And still what that would be, we didn't know. And one of the unique and most challenging aspects of America's participation, and the reason that in the last 10 expos we're the last country to agree to participate, is because it is illegal for us to spend any government money on the World's Fair. There's a long history we can talk about. We've learned a lot about what that means now, but we're the only country of 148 countries for whom that is true. And so in order to agree to participate, you have to believe you can find the money. In order to find the money, you have to understand what you might be able to do. In order to understand what you could do, you have to know how much money you have to spend. And so you can see how basically an episode of Veep comes to life if you watch Veep. That's sort of what happens and how the government runs. It's a documentary. You might not know that, actually. And so we began, and we is mostly the International Culinary Center and Dorothy Cann Hamilton and the James Beard Foundation, represented by me, kept dancing along, thinking, wow, this is interesting. We kept going to dinners. We kept calling people and talking about the potential, trying to soft circle some money to support if anyone could find it. And quite honestly, we had the idea started to gel, and we had a great vision that this could be an important thing, perhaps as important as the 1939 World's Fair, where the French pavilion sort of changed the course of culinary history in New York and in America for the next 4 or 5 decades, because the restaurant there sort of was, for many Americans, the first taste of French food. And the people who were behind that went on to sort of create some of the greatest restaurants of the last century. Le Pavillon, in fact, was a team, led by Henri Soulet, who was the maitre d' and general manager of the French Pavilion restaurant, was arguably the best restaurant in New York for 25 years after that event. Anyway, so things boiled and things bubbled, and the idea that maybe we could go to Europe and we could show them what has happened since then, how the tables have turned is perhaps too negative a statement, but just how much has changed since someone's first taste of haute cuisine, let's say. Not that people were not eating good food before then, but certainly the masses did not have that much of an interest in gastronomy, to today when, whether or not you have an interest in gastronomy, the sort of caliber of chefs in America, the quality of the ingredients in some places, with people obviously who have means to obtain them, but certainly the skill level and the appreciation and the understanding of food and cuisine has I don't know, multiplied by 550 million%. And how fun would it be to go to Europe and figure out a way to present that in this global food expo? And that's what really resonated with everybody that we spoke to. And also, increasingly in the conversations, perhaps to change the perception of what America's role might be in the global food system. As my bio suggested, we've created over the last 5 or 6 years some very profound, or we facilitated some very profound conversations and inspired some important people to act on some beliefs that perhaps we could help take what we know, what some of the great chefs and some of the great food people know about food, and use that as a tool for social change in some way. That perhaps if everyone, we could develop or engender an appreciation for a different type of food than the mass-produced industrial whatever, we could find a tipping point and help increase the access and accessibility of that food and the consequent environmental health and physical health and let's say community health that comes with that sort of change more broadly. And so putting all of these pieces together, we did somehow convince the United States to at least issue a request for proposal, an RFP, to try to find someone who might build this pavilion if we were to say we were coming. And I use these conditional words because everything to this moment, in fact, this morning in Washington at the State Department, is conditional, dealing with the State Department. And July 15th last year, they actually officially registered the request for proposals. We felt, after doing all of this work and talking to people and not really successfully finding the money because there wasn't a concrete idea and there wasn't necessarily a thing that we were doing, and even the request for proposal doesn't mean you're going to have a proposal. You know, it's a lot of tentatives, a lot of conditionals. Dorothy and I decided we were done, actually. We got America to do it, and we had done what the Italians had asked, and it was like, okay, that's fine. Let someone else build a pavilion. And when we pulled out, or when we told our Italian counterparts that we were not intending to submit a proposal, quite honestly, they freaked out. I don't know the Italian for that, but they went pazzo. Because we had inspired them about what this American pavilion could be. And in their minds, what they didn't want it to be was, you walk through some giant golden arches and you saw GMO corn growing in fields of wheat. Like, that's exactly what they wanted to avoid. We have to remember Italy is the birthplace of the slow food movement, which actually was born in reaction to the announcement of the arrival of the McDonald's on the Spanish Steps in Rome, a direct consequence. Carlo Petrini says, wait a second, we can't let this happen. Let's create this movement, call it slow food. Just a sidebar, that McDonald's did open and is one of the most popular in all of Italy, but that's a whole other part of a conversation we'd like to have at our pavilion. And so they wanted us to submit, like, really badly. That's when we called Jim, I think. When that was on July 15th, when the RFP was issued, and July 16th, I think we had a meeting in your office with a bunch of people who we had strung along with playing our flute and following behind us to the office, and said, we have 6 weeks, can we pull something together here? On that team were folks like Michael Beirut and Pentagram, Jim's former home, some social media folks, some integrative design people, some technology people, some other food people. It was just a group of people inspired by the idea of the potential of what this could be. We spent a very busy 6 weeks. Oh, and fundraisers, of course, were part of that, an important part of that. So we spent 6 weeks putting together a proposal. We came up with this idea and this visual to call it American Food 2.0. And the 2.0 referring almost intentionally ambiguously to perhaps the influence of technology and innovation in the future, but also the idea that everyone in Europe knows 1.0 with the hamburgers and hot dogs and French fries, but maybe we'd present 2.0, the next version of what American food is, and all of the other connotations that can mean. We've learned, and today we actually we're in the midst of a messaging exercise about what exactly American Food 2.0 is, and Jim and I are of the belief that its ambiguity is actually part of its power, but try to get the State Department to believe that anyway. So we did it, and then they received 5 proposals for pavilions. 3 of them, I think, were taken more seriously than the other 2. One of them focused very much on the concept of sustainability, less on food, but more on energy and use and climate-related issues. Another one was much more entertainment. Disney people were a part of that. And we were the food proposal, basically. And after a long back and forth and thousands of pages of questions and answers and vetting, we won the bid. And November 12th, an announcement was made in Italy at the Expo headquarters, in which you've never seen more paparazzi in your life, that America was coming. The camera's flashes are still making my eyes see spots. And from that point on, we've been in a very difficult And also, what did I say today? It was both exciting and terrifying dance to try to raise, and you'll see why, $60 million, which is not a small amount of money, in a very short period of time to do something that people don't even know is happening, mostly. But happens to be happening about food, about this topic that is such an important, we feel it's such a flashpoint right now in terms of interest, or tipping point might be a better word, interest among students who are a big part of this, among the social media world, which is a big part of this, among obviously our relations with Europe, for which food and the sort of global food security is a huge part of those relations. It's in Italy, which is a food destination, and the bilateral relationship between America and Italy is a tremendous impetus for us. If this were in Yozu, where they had an expo several years ago in the oceans, we would not be as excited about bringing everyone to Yozu, Korea, not for any reason other than we know people want to go to Milan. In fact, we heard today 30,000 American students will be there this year and next year. And so we have a built-in platform, I think, to have this conversation. We'll talk a lot more about that. That was a long preamble to the presentation about the design, but I would say that a lot of the challenges have to do, and this will impact what I think Jim is going to talk about a little bit, with how do we create this thing, which is temporary but not really, which is about a bunch of issues related to food, but also about America. This is, of course, a representation of America in a World's Fair that happens to be about food, and is tailored to the sort of future-driven World's Fair ethos, but also deals with some serious issues that we have, and addresses some very complicated and not always positive aspects about American culture, and tries to not deny them, but sort of reposition what's going on and show a different side. So it's a real basketful of challenges. The reward, we think, and you'll see, is tremendous for our partners, for our funders, for the people participating. One of the most encouraging things, I think, is that on our team are many people who have worked on these expos in the past. Shanghai was the last one, and 85 million visitors were there. And everything about these things, they're difficult. It's 24 hours. Your life will never be the same, but then it was so rewarding that you come back. And to me, that's very encouraging, that there's something very satisfying about having an opportunity to represent the America that you and we know and want to try to provide a showcase for, and at the same time not avoid all of the hard questions that we're actually eager to engage people in. So it's just really the beginning of this journey. There's a lot ahead, and so much has happened, but certainly prime among, and you'll see in some of the examples Jim will show of the other pavilions and the history of World's Fairs, one of the key things about these gatherings is the sort of inspiration of the architecture and the programming. We call it the hardware and the software sometimes in our parlance, and they're just amazing. You feel like a little kid again back in '64 walking through the World's Fair, and the world is it's more complicated maybe, but it's also still as fresh and inspiring as it can be. And enter Jim Biber.
So that's a kind of conceptual framework for what goes on. So I'll try to sort of give some context. I'll try to show you the process of what we did. But what's important is that one of the things that's important is that Mitchell has talked about sort of a timeline in which all of a sudden we were competing for this project, and so it's really it may be 20 or 30 million people, but it really happens in 3 weeks. That it takes it's 6 actually, but we had to draw it, so we had to design it in 3 weeks and draw it in 3 weeks, and that's kind of an extraordinary thing to have to live with, for the next several years. But just to give it a kind of historical context, so Expo, people go, Expo, World's Fair, what is it? International Exposition, they're all exactly the same thing. And they all tend to be about, the bright and shiny future ahead. They really started as industrial fairs. And the first one that, of note, there is actually one, this is the first real expo, I think, is the Crystal Palace in 1851. In London, and it was kind of height of Victorian. It was an exhibit of 14,000 different exhibitors under a glass building of 1 million square feet, the largest covered space in the world. Designed, fabricated, and built in 9 months by Joseph Paxton, who designed greenhouses. The most extraordinary display of nations, machinery, people, it was a kind of true extravaganza. And it was so successful that the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum, is in fact, and Albert Hall, funded from the proceeds of this. Ours is doubtful going to be quite that successful. I don't think there are any museums after it. But just to jump way ahead to the 1939 World's Fair, this was a fair, again, about the future, and it was very consciously, poised right at the end of the Depression, right before World War II. This, there was clear noises about that going on.
I'll just say that he skipped the Eiffel Tower and the Ferris wheel, which were both products of World's Fairs.
That's right, the Ferris wheel in Chicago, the Eiffel Tower.
Right.
I mean, and there are extraordinary history. I mean, we do 2 hours just on World's Fairs, and even since then, I think there have been some really interesting World's Fairs. But New York is a really interesting example because there were 2 World's Fairs, pre-war and post-war, and of very different characters, I would argue. And also the change, this is the change from a single building that encompassed everything to a campus, a kind of compound, a fair grounds that was really all about lots and lots of individual buildings. And that's a gigantic change that still persists. And so the Trilon in Perisphere, the big globe and, obelisk as the symbol, was enormously powerful. Norman Bell Geddes did the GM Pavilion, which actually is right down there, as Futurama, and there were so many firsts there. I mean, it was a really remarkable fair. This is the plan of the 1964 World's Fair in the same space, and maybe you couldn't read what was the pool of peace in 1939 becomes the pool of industry up here. So you kind of get where this is going. This was actually, this is Robert Moses, and I think the first one was as well, but he did not get BIE sanction for this. So this was not really an official World's Fair, which meant a lot of countries pulled out and a lot of corporations took the place. So it was a very odd. I went to this about 10 times, so never made it to the 39 World's Fair somehow. But what's so interesting is, compare these two things. Here they are sort of in the same spaces, and what's introduced at the 39 World's Fair: television, first television broadcast, fluorescent lights, air conditioning, the electric typewriter, the Futurama, which is this incredible exhibit by Norman Bell Geddes that all other exhibits have kind of depended on, the ride and so on, and this thing called the electric calculator, which turned out to be the computer. So that's what's introduced in 1939. 1964 is just as important. We have color television, huge advance. The Ford Mustang, which is now exactly 50 years old. By the way, it opened 50 years ago today. This was the opening day. Belgian waffles, huge thing. Warhol is crossed off because Andy Warhol did a 13-panel mural in the New York State Pavilion that Philip Johnson commissioned, but it was 13 Most Wanted, FBI. And 3 days before the fair, they had him painted over, in silver, of course, but he hadn't painted over. So there's a missing Warhol, and it's like sitting in the Orozco room is kind of a perfect little recall. The world's largest cheese was there. That was very important. And then Disney did about 4 or 5 exhibits, 4 or 5 pavilions, and a small world started there. So you can see, right, and the song. And so you can see they're both very important in slightly different ways. And these are the sorts of pavilions that were featured in the 64 World's Fair, like giant kind of cars, a Ferris wheel made out of a rubber tire, dinosaurs, don't ask me why, I'm not exactly sure. But this kind of, pardon me? Right, but I mean,
And they were going to the World's Fair. They did a lot of campaigns with the dinosaurs moving to the World's Fair.
But the Sinclair was like a Brontosaurus, and this is a T-Rex. They proliferate, right? Maybe it ate the Brontosaurus. But and then the New York State Pavilion by Philip Johnson and a kind of Coke. So it was a very strange fair, considered to be actually the least successful fair, but for me the most fun ever. But there was a kind of serious aftermath of this in '67 in Montreal. Canadians. Uber alles. They make a fair that's actually really once again about the future and really once again about startling architecture. So it's beautifully organized. They build an island to do it, which was kind of spectacular. Buckminster Fuller builds a kind of Crystal Palace, once again, this transparent geodesic dome, an amazing building, which I think may actually still be there in its frame, with a funny little other building inside, which was kind of the disappointing part. Moshe Safdie does his first real building, Habitat, which was a prefabricated concrete module, still there, still kind of a remarkable piece of architecture, and of course the greatest posters of their time. And so it's been pretty much downhill from there. If we go to Shanghai, also on a kind of bit of an island, what these pavilions have devolved into are closed boxes filled with television screens, in effect. Pulsed theaters where people in large crowds are moved into a theater, they're shown a 3 or 4 minute show, they're moved to the next theater, the people follow them, and then you come out through the gift shop, exit through the gift shop, and purchased lots of T-shirts. This is the USA Pavilion at Shanghai, designed by a Canadian, so I don't think we should really be taking full responsibility for it. But it's just an awful building. It's an awful building in so many ways, bloated, meaningless, and so on. But, there are other buildings at that fair which took the same closed box approach, but were actually quite a bit more successful, like Iceland. I think it's kind of a big ice cube is kind of a cute idea for Iceland. Again, closed box. This is probably the most remarkable and most popular building at the fair. This is the UK Pavilion by Thomas Heatherwick. Each of these little spines has a seed at one end, a different seed. And on the inside, those seeds kind of coalesce. Or maybe the seeds are on the inside and the light comes through a fiber optic, I think is what it was.
Yeah, seeds are on the inside.
Seeds are on the inside, so they penetrate it. And what's amazing, and that he never told the committee there, is that wherever you stand, there's a kind of built-in hidden Union Jack, just by the virtue of the shape of this thing, it's a kind of genius. I don't know why he simply wasn't asked to do it again, but he wasn't. They've just, in fact, returned. I'll show you some of their examples. So the Expo in Milan is a very different kind of fair. It's organized completely differently than any fair I've seen. It's urban, in a sense, rather than suburban. It's based on the kind of Carta Decumanus, which is the Roman kind of grid, the sort of center of town. All of the country pavilions are organized along one alley, so you could actually walk down one side and back the other, see every single country. That's very unusual in a World's Fair. Usually it's impossible to find your way around. The sites are long and narrow. That's actually, I think, kind of great coming from New York. Another architect told me he was really disgusted with the plan. I said, well, why? It's like that people can't build object buildings. And he said, yeah, I do object buildings. So he can't do these kind of sculptural in the round things. They're all very narrow. The scale of it's really very strange, though. This is the scale of the site and the building sitting on Park Avenue. So the site's almost 2 blocks long, but as narrow as the mall of Park Avenue, which is kind of crazy. It's a couple of brownstones wide, actually. One of the important concepts that Mitchell had developed was the idea of food trucks as a kind of important way to serve food and an important marker of food. And maybe you should just kind of talk about some of the things that you were thinking about.
I mean, what can we present? Obviously, we're not going to go to Italy and build an Italian restaurant, and we're certainly not going to build a French restaurant. And we are, although some of us in the food world are tired of the food truck thing, which arguably has jumped the shark. Well, when I was literally actually, Joël Robuchon was in a food truck for Air France parked at Union Square on 16th Street. You know that it's no longer exactly hip and cool. However, it actually still really is hip and cool. And when you go to Portland or you go to Austin or even to some smaller towns with less of a food truck culture, LA is a prime example. You just see an incredible world, a streetscape of these things, and how American would it be to involve the to make the food service at the Pavilion food truck? And so we've called this piece of it Food Truck Nation, and we're going to be, and we had proposed to sort of rally up ambassadors around the country to represent some of these street foods. I mean, of course, and as always the case, there's a tradition of food trucks in Italy that predates, I'm sure, the founding of America, the porchetta trucks, the rosticceria trucks that come in the markets. No one really goes, well, you don't generally go and eat there, although in Florence you go to the tripaio trucks, the tripe trucks, and you eat there with your little glass of wine, and you stand at the little cart. But this is not exactly what they're about. I happen to think that's going to make these resonate pretty strongly among a largely Italian audience, but it's a very American, of this moment idea, which is about the food. It's certainly about youth culture. It's about social media, because they sort of exist these days because of their Twitter followings and their Tumblrs, and these sort of what generates business of these trucks. But it's also about entrepreneurship and, in some ways, a low barrier job creation, sort of American start yourself, you can have a restaurant too idea. And it's in a vehicle, which is also very American. So we just feel like they're just iconic, or going to be iconic at this fair.
And they are, and in fact, tonight's not only the 50th anniversary of the 64 World's Fair, it's also the premiere of Jean Favre's new movie called Chef, which is about a chef that starts in a restaurant, ends up in a food truck. So it's a timely moment for us to be here. We would have been there, except for you guys were much more important. But the idea that this is, the road, the notion of the road, and the American fascination with the road, and the American fascination of food, not just in trucks, but along the road, roadside food, other sorts of modes of food distribution, so to speak, that are really uniquely American, like the boardwalk and other things. So that became part of the kind of initial thinking. And when we were putting this together, Mitchell, had a very long, sort of well-developed intellectual framework for this presentation, but also said, I think this thing should be design-driven, and that there has to be a kind of a call and response about this, and so there was. And so we were thinking about the road, very much so. I started with this idea that wouldn't it be terrific, there were a lot of restrictions about the size of this thing, but wouldn't it be terrific if you had to go up to the roof and then kind of spiraled around like a kind of roadway and then exited? And that was, it's a Guggenheim scheme, right? You take the elevator up and you spiral around down. That was a possibility. I looked at the whole idea of tracing, grow, process, cook, serve, distribute, or distribute actually comes sometimes before process, recycle as a kind of demonstratable sequence of exhibitions within the pavilion, so that could sort of follow the road. We looked at things like that. We looked at the idea of really simple structures like barns, this idea of repetitive, simple, open frames, really iconic, but obviously, but not literally. And so we also looked at the idea of farms, but there's really no room for a farm there. So we thought about the idea of vertical farms. And now vertical farms, I had to do that, I'm sorry. Once you have the capability of doing that, you're really pretty much obliged to. And this was so the idea of a farm that was, there's a lot of talk about vertical farms. It means something different than what we're doing. This was a kind of demonstration of an iconic vertical farm as opposed to a working vertical farm, although it will be a harvestable farm. And so we put together things like this, which were really kind of word collages of ways of describing, the arrival, the escalator to the roof, the garden, the process, cooking. And so this whole idea became the basis of a way of constructing a building, which ended up looking a lot like this, exactly like this actually. So along the side, which faces a pedestrian alley, most people are going to walk along this covered decumanus pathway, but there are streets. If that's an avenue, there are streets. And so along that long facade, we arranged this vertical farm, touched the ground in just two places, a kind of forecourt, which had a boardwalk extending up and through the building and out. In this case, a big video wall along one side, and then a hydroponic trellis on the roof, because there's a height restriction of 12 meters, but you could kind of go to 17 if you had stuff that wasn't really building up there. So we were trying to create a big roof terrace. So that's where this started, and you can see Alice Waters hanging out there, which turned out to be a little bit of a problem. And then the food trucks, just trying to find a place for them sitting in the front there. If you peeled away the farm, you would see that on the roof there was a big terrace, and this is, I'd almost forgotten this, it's so long ago. This is Morse code that are planters, 50 planters, 51 because of the White House, that spell out the United States of America in Morse codes. This idea that you could have a kind of, photo op from a satellite.
And the planters were going to be growing both sort of iconic crops and sort of representations of flavors of ethnic communities and
exactly.
all sorts of modern dance. No,
long ago idea.
Yeah.
And you can see the repetitive frame. When you take all that away, the exhibit was a kind of a set of floating pods that carried this food, alimentary canal sort of process. And then there was the boardwalk, which ramped up and down, and actually was going to have food trucks on it so they could actually drive up and through the building. And then finally, the ground floor, we had this notion that the ground floor should be open and people should be able to wander around. We were going to put stores there. It turned out to be way more valuable than wanting to just leave it open. And so it looked like this. That's James Beard, obviously, and that's Alice Waters, and there were some issues about that.
Those are oranges.
And those are oranges, right? And so this was supposed to be an entire video wall. We were informed that a video wall that size would cost about $14 million. We thought maybe that's not what it's going to be. Perhaps.
Unless there's anyone here who would like to see
right,
it.
It could,
It has a checkbook.
It would have your name on it. It would be on the roof, the hydroponic trellis.
Yeah, and your picture. Sure.
Right,
Who is that person? Don't ask.
So on the roof, the hydroponic trellis, which was for shade, you can see the canisters. There's New York, there's Ohio, each one identified, and and then the rear garden, which had the rear garden, and and the inside, which was these pods and this wall, all sort of coming together to make this very active space in which people could watch people enjoy the exhibit, but also the exhibit could enjoy the rest of the crowd as well. There was only one, there wasn't only one problem, there's a lot of problems, but one of the problems was Alice Waters. She wasn't really on board with necessarily our take on this. But the real problem was that we brought it to the State Department. They said, well, this is really great, except there are a couple things missing, like the name of the country and the red, white, and blue. And so this was the next iteration. It was kind of embarrassing, actually. This was the next generation that then started to add some of those elements with a happier. This was considered to be a friendlier picture of James Deere, although I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, we part of our planning was to have a manifesto project where at the end, after a series of thought leader gatherings, we would create a document about corporate and personal and corporate responsibility vis-a-vis food. And when, let's say, a group of people from a certain political party saw this picture of Beard and heard about the manifesto project, asked us literally, seriously, if we were communists and we were building a communist pavilion. What? I'm agnostic.
We were, but we're no longer.
Yeah.
Who do they think that was?
Stalin or something.
Stalin, yeah. They should really come here and see. That's like looks nothing like.
Yeah, really.
More like Gandhi. Actually.
Now this school, that's another story.
Exactly.
Right.
So we did night shots and so on. So this is where we were when we won. So we did win, and winning is not necessarily winning. We're having to raise $60 million is sort of like losing in a funny way, but we hope to turn it into winning. And also the idea that the upper level would turn into a fantastic, every rooftop in Milan has a bar, restaurant, fantastic place to be. And so we thought if we lit it from below, kind of 80s disco floor style, because it has
Also
a glass
very popular
floor,
in Milan.
very popular in Milan, 1980s. It would be the best place to be in the whole fair, and we would serve drinks, and there'd be a party every night. That was very nice, except it really didn't work. And so we did kind of American Food 2.0, American Pavilion 2.0, in which we started to look at, well, maybe the hydroponic trellis isn't quite the thing. Photovoltaics make a certain amount of sense. The glass roof floor remained, the vertical farm remained. But if we put the exhibition below, that sure made a lot of sense. And so we started to rethink this. And, the idea of moving from dark to light and transparent was an idea. There's this crazy idea about the different ways you could use the building if you had to shut down the roof to do an event, and so this is nonsense to you, of course, but it was actually meaningful.
Yeah, well, although one of the things that we've learned in this process, as I said, this was a group of people inspired by the idea of doing this, not a group of people who are expo professionals, of which there's a large category of people who move from one of these to the next. They're very lucrative. People build pavilions, and this one ran pavilions in that one, that sort of stuff. That's not who we are. But one of the things we've learned is that an important part of these pavilions happens not to the public's view. The VIP suite where the heads of industry meet the heads of state, the private entertaining, the various gatherings or whatever, or even when for an event the whole thing is closed and taken over for some other purpose. Right. So they tend to have to be much more flexible than you would imagine a space like a museum exhibit. Well, I guess museums are pretty flexible, but more like that, more flexible like that than building a solid structure of an exhibit that you walk through in a certain way.
And also we were trying to learn from the UK Pavilion at Shanghai. UK Pavilion was the most popular, not just because it was the most beautiful, but because they stopped the queues and they just let everybody in. And letting everybody in to kind of have a free zone, a non-queued zone, turned out to be a kind of interesting way to allow people to see the pavilion without waiting. And maybe the next time they would be able to wait on the queued. So this is also a complicated way of organizing open and guided and unguided tours, let's say. So it started to look like this. Oh, we also realized that any part of the vertical farm that was anywhere near the ground would be stripped clean to about 7 feet as people harvested their own. And so we raised that and floated this whole vertical farm, created this glass roof, created fireworks, created actually a spectacle on the wall, which we're really serious about, even though people kind of keep thinking we're kidding it, which would be to have sort of harvesting angels, to have a show, an aerial ballet with people like De La Guarda and Forza Bruta and so on, and Cirque du Soleil, so that literally there was a kind of spectacle. So there's a serious part of this because it has real didactic content. It actually means something. It is really harvested on a daily basis, but it also has a kind of spectacle. Looking through the pavilion, you can see that there is this idea of openness. That the idea that America, we were trying to represent in America, or an ambition for America to be open, transparent, accessible. That's what we hope it is. It's not always that, but that's an aspiration. And at the same time, to include a very carefully worked out show. There's also this waterfall here, which was kind of a photo op and has to do with water systems circulating through the building, using it for irrigation, using it for flushing towards gray water and so on. So it became a building of systems that are generating power, systems of water, and so on. Kept the disco floor. Really will not give that up. But did add these gigantic fans. There's a company in the U.S. called Big Ass Fans, and these are 27-foot wide fans. Are just so because there's the whole issue of cooling becomes a bit of an issue. Daytime as well. And then from the side that faces the Kuwait Pavilion, which is right next door, the idea of using perforated steel. Red, white, and blue is great, but you could really kind of go crazy with it. So we took steel, perforated steel, and said, well, we're going to use rusted steel, blued steel, and polished steel, and that's going to be our red, white, and blue, and you'll either get it or you won't. Kuwait will get it because, well, you'll see why Kuwait gets it. It's going to be without realizing it, we've created quite a kind of desert storm thing going on here, but. So from the back, so that if the front is a gentle step ramp, the back is really a theater to see to use as a kind of place to watch what's going on down behind. There's this thick wall that's got all sorts of services in it. And then on the roof, we've now divided it into a big VIP area, roof terrace facing one way, and then a big public roof on the other the way, served in both directions by the same catering system. So because raising money, one of the things they say is, well, and what is it we get for our $3 million again? And one of those things is access to this VIP suite, which is turns out to be a lot more important for our privately funded pavilion than it is for, say, Kuwait. We've also been doing a lot of studies about the vertical farm. It really is going to be a harvestable farm. We're talking about how the plants are oriented so that the ones that need light are oriented towards the light, so that the wall has a lot more movement and motion to it, and this is in development, as are lots of other things. But this is the scary thing. That's how many days are left before this thing opens, and it is. There's a clock in Milan that we really want to just unplug, but these things always have battery backups. So that's the biggest. That's our fear. And I'm just going to kind of leave it at that, but kind of move on to show you some of the other things that are going on. The good news is, although we're terribly behind, not a single pavilion has been built. And only Germany, of course, is actually in construction, and only with a foundation. So I think and the UK has just gotten back responses from their design RFP. So I'm feeling better every day. This is the Italian pavilion, a gigantic, this is 4 or 5 times the size of ours, and it's a permanent building. It will remain. It's quite.
Ours has to go back to the dirt.
Oh, right. Ours gets dismantled after 6 months. So the sustainability fair is going to take itself apart and waste an enormous amount of energy. It's a terrible contradiction, but that is how fairs work. And in fact, that's why. And maybe I think there's a slide of it here. Vietnam rice paddies. Some of these I think get pretty funny. And this one is. So that's the rice paddies, and that's the desert. I think this is Saudi Arabia actually. Or Swiss cheese. Maybe it's Switzerland because it's a wedge.
Not Switzerland.
It's a wedge.
A golf course.
World's largest cheese. I think they were thinking about 64. The German pavilion is a kind of Fry Otto, kind of tent structure thing from the 70s, I think. Norman Foster designed the United Arab Emirates. I don't exactly get what it is, but Norman Foster designed.
It's like a wadi.
It's mostly outside, which is actually kind of interesting. This is one of my favorites. I love this. Carlo Ratti at MIT designed this. It's New Holland. New Holland is a farm implement maker. They are actually owned by Fiat Chrysler. And so he has a tipped field and robot-controlled tractors that can draw anything in the ground. They could draw a picture of you. They could draw, Juan Valdez or something. But it's the idea that this thing is constantly being replowed and redrawn, and then there's a pavilion underneath it. I think this is actually kind of terrific. Now, this was actually the original plan that Herzog de Meuron and Stefano Boeri did. And they recognized that there is a tremendous waste in building things and tearing them down. They said, we're just going to do the entire fair under tents. And that was actually a really brilliant idea. The organization of that remains. The tents, of course, do not. That was just not enough individual expression. And this is the Kuwait pavilion. So our pavilion sits kind of ghosted in right here. And their pavilion sits here. It has to do with desalinization of water and hydroponics, 2 very important things for them. I think this is a mountain thing. But what's odd to me is this kind of entry desert that you cross. and our gigantic flag, the back of our gigantic flag, is going to sit right there. And I'm thinking it's going to dwarf this flag. They may have to get a much bigger flag. The flag that we're talking about is like, what we did is like 20 by 30 feet. It's huge. And so I have a feeling this whole Desert Storm thing is going to be the visual joke of the fair. And I'm sorry, we did not do it out of malice. So the UK just has a short list. It's a very odd short list. I'll just show you a couple of them. I can't explain them except to say that this is the Lilliputian version of something. This is kind of swoopy, and one's a forest. This one is actually interesting. I don't know that there's a pavilion in this. Water is nature's silent currency. It's all about water, and coming from the UK, that seems like kind of slightly double entendre, but I don't know what the pavilion is. And then it gets then it really starts to break down. So Strawberry Fields Forever, these are shortlisted. This is the group from which they will choose the winner. And then something that looks like it's out of the Fantastic Mr. Fox, with like flying pigs, and I mean they are serious. So, yeah, wow, exactly, really.
Well,
because
they probably heard we'd have acrobats harvesting, and they wanted flying pigs.
Exactly,
Right?
but so imagine the most sophisticated, the most beautiful pavilion from 5 years ago now turns into, well, we'll see what they do. This, of course, is this was recently unveiled as the mascot of Expo Milan. This is designed by Disney.
Its name is Foodie.
Foodie. What else?
It's a good way to put an end to that word, which most foodies
Yeah,
hate.
exactly. Yeah. It's so remarkably unsophisticated, in my opinion. I mean, this is so. So this is Arcambolo. I mean, it's like this is. I mean, it's been done and better in Italy before. But of course, Arcambolo didn't have a whole family of guys and all the friends, and you can imagine all the toys. This is really surprising because I think that this is a really beautiful logo that they designed, and I can't fit the two things together. But what you have to remember about all of these fairs is that they're all about commerce. This is entirely about business, and this ultimately is what these things are about. This is the Illy, a big sponsor of the fair, sells these lovely plates, and I think this is ultimately what the Belgian waffles and the Illy plates will be.
And Illy coffee will be the coffee of the American
That's
Pavilion.
right. That's
They're
right.
one of our first sponsors. I just got texted a photo from Charles de Gaulle yesterday of someone who
Himself.
landed. Yeah, right. No,
Wow.
he's on Twitter.
Late texting, right.
And
There was a
the
delay.
airport, his airport, with someone drinking out of an Expo cup. So this
Yeah.
is really profoundly penetrated across Europe. It is the first European Expo in about 20 years, and will probably be the last for at least 20 years. So a lot of the EU is putting.
And not the
muscle
first
behind
one
it.
in Milan, actually. There was another expo,
Oh.
an earlier expo in Milan. And that's kind of the end of the show. But it is interesting how, if you go to Milan, you'd think the fair was going on now. It's everywhere. It's omnipresent. It's in the news. People have been arrested. There've already been scandals. You come here, and it's barely recognizable.
Yeah.
It's a very
Even among giant food companies who are based in Italy, they don't. Their American subsidiaries don't know what's happening. There's one other piece before you stop that we should just mention that isn't designed yet, which is why it's not there, and that is there will be a freestanding restaurant structure, the James Beard American Restaurant, which is going to, not really be a recreation of the Beard House, but certainly have a rotating roster of chefs and a pretty fixed experience, and also a more casual, like hamburger experience and cocktail bar. We chose, because what we didn't talk about is the fact that 20 to 30 million visitors are expected at this expo. We're told to figure 8 million of them thereabouts coming into the American Pavilion. So the numbers, the traffic of this thing that breaks down to 1,200 an hour is staggering. And so the idea of having a sit-down restaurant was just too much for anyone to bear as a physical block in this long, narrow space. It just didn't seem a good use of space. But a separate building that will sort of be a satellite of the American Pavilion will exist and will operate presumably we'll be able to bring American ingredients, even those that aren't allowed in the EU. All the countries are trying to bring in everything that they can for this, and all sorts of stuff like that. And then we should just ask questions, and open it to questions, really. Yes. Comments?
You got this mic.
Sure.
I don't understand. If the U.S. government doesn't fund it, what's the relationship between you guys and the State Department? And the second question is, I've been to in D.C., the Museum of the American Indian, where they have only food from the Americas. I was wondering, you're going to showcase native food.
two very good questions. The first, the answer is still being illuminated, I would think.
Well, I mean,
we are working for the State Department.
We are representing the U.S., and as part of that, even though they don't pay for any of it, they do have, but they have both some control over the message, but also they have enormous, well, yet to be demonstrated, enormous influence on the ability to raise money. The idea that the president has endorsed this, that the State Department is on board, actually
Making phone calls.
means quite a bit to potential donors.
And so,
corporations.
and so Jim said that this was these are about commerce, which is true, but the way that commerce is enacted is about government relations. This is a Washington event, we've learned and been told, and when you see sort of the way that people come and participate, it's not unlike other public-private partnerships that, I mean, which is a euphemism for we're in control and you pay, but that's what it becomes, and it is the only one of those 148 pavilions that is in the situation. They are all funded, some of them not exclusively, but the majority of the funding comes from the government themselves. And it's only since 1992 when Congress passed an act, and someone told me it was actually a rogue person, no one even knew what they were voting on because they didn't even know what the Expos were, that happened, and so it's a congressional decree. States can participate. It's only about federal State Department money. Other departments, Department of Commerce, Ag, can contribute money to them. States can, all that sort of stuff, just not the Department of State. No one can tell us.
Abuse. There were abuses to the budgets, and that was one congressman's reaction, and one senator's reaction, and nobody else cared enough to.
Yeah, very similar.
It's exactly the same issue.
We also don't pay our dues to the BIE, which is there's an international body just like the Olympics, which is the Bureau International des Expositions, and we're not a member either. Probably since '64 when we went rogue.
The native food.
Oh, right. And the native food thing is it's a very interesting question. One of the themes, there's many sub-themes of what we are going to be presenting, and diversity is obviously a huge one, both of our people, but of the influence in our cuisine, and that's certainly something that keeps coming up. It's not, this falls under the desk of public diplomacy and the pan-Eurasian branch of the State Department, and so the bilateral relationship between the 30 million Italian Americans and Italy is really prime, not so much the Native American piece in the messaging. However, it will be part of what we want to present. Certainly the unique contribution. I mean, corn is a perfect example. Corn saved Italy in the late 1880s. I mean, it then led to some other nutritional diseases because they brought it over. People were dying of starvation. They fed them all this corn. They didn't slake it. They had pellagra because you don't get the vitamin B complex.
And Italy is very grateful for us for giving them the tomato.
Yeah, exactly. They've done a lot with it.
Yeah.
No, I mean, but part of this is what we hope. This is why we're here. Honestly, it's this relationship with Italy and Europe, but specifically Atlantically Italy, yeah, that we really hope to engage with, and the Italian American community, which is throwing tremendous enthusiasm to this. This is a real point of pride, especially when you look at our immigration history, and much of what brought people here in the sort of from the 1880s to the 1940s and the mass migrations were hunger. And now the 2.0 piece is actually overconsumption, not underconsumption, and sort of I think there's an interesting historical resonance about that and the issues that we intend to deal with.
Hi, I'll also ask two questions. One, you talk about it being related to commerce, everything that's going on at the Expo. How do you think of labor fitting into the exhibition? And also, as I've been to many different museums that discuss food and the history of America with food and seen the kind of bent that they take on it, I wonder how much your design team and your work influences what the topics within the exhibitions will be.
Well, I can answer the second one, and maybe you can answer the first. We see the building as a kind of scaffold, right? A scaffold for ideas. What you didn't see in any of this, and why the building might look a bit kind of empty in a way, is that none of the content is there. There's this thing is really driven by a show, a very intensely developed show, by things that happen in the larger space that are kinetic screens that display things, and so it is not so much that the building sort of influences these things, or the design influences these things, as the design is made to accommodate them. So it's really a kind of receptive design. That's part of the reason for the kind of repetitive, simple structure and so on.
I would also add that the focus has always been the future, not the past, and it's one of the challenges. When you are first given the idea for the project, you think, oh, let's just show all the great things that happen in America. But actually, we're supposed to be thinking the other way,
Right.
which poses some of the problems. To me, what's been interesting to watch is that really all you can build today is what you can build today. You actually can't build what you'll be able to build in the future. And so even though there are a lot of ideas about the future, you might have to jerry-rig them because they actually don't exist now. They're in the future. One of the things that keeps coming up to me, I don't know if you're familiar with Warren Belasco's work. He's an anthropologist who's a great writer and thinker, and his last book was A History of the Future of Food. And to me, that's what this is that's what World's Fairs are about. They're sort of a sociological, anthropological moment where we're thinking about the future from the present time, and it's a fascinating journey. So it's a challenge to think about what we want to do. For us, I would say, and labor is a great question. This falls under the rubric, which is much more resonant in Europe and in European circles, of sustainability, and the EU, is one of the great sort of bureaucracies producing rules and regulations relating to sustainability, and labor is always a piece of that if you define sustainability in that way. We haven't called it out, quite honestly, directly, but one of the things we hope to do, and to make use of social media with, is to bring into the pavilion sort of real things happening, a sort of StoryCorps of food in America, which is not all just going to be, happy Thanksgiving dinners and whatever. It's going to be people on farms. It's going to be people in poverty. It's going to be people, we want it to be this representative snapshot of this moment in food and what we can do with the power of that, looking towards the future for change and for celebration and for, America. So it's a challenge, and we haven't worked out the details of the narrative, let's say. Part of it is waiting for the structure, the scope, the budget, the different forces that weigh in. Every time we have a meeting at the State Department, there's a new program and another thing, and they're impressive things that you don't know are happening. We didn't know are happening, and we're in the food business, and so they're not all disingenuous, let's spin it this way. It's like, how are we going to tell this story? What are the pieces that will be interesting and unique for America in this context of 148 other stories? Saudi Arabia is doing water, for instance. China's doing haute cuisine and sort of the real regional Chinese cuisine. Like, there are different stories to tell in that context also. So it's a process just beginning.
And this was really supposed to be an open system of questions. This was a debate. The pavilion is not about establishing a kind of orthodoxy of a way of thinking about it, as opposed to presenting ideas. And one of my favorite, and it's supposed to be provocative, quite provocative when it can be. And so Mitchell had this idea that we would take a live stalk of GMO corn and put it in a kind of sealed glass case and bring it on a
Briggs truck or
Briggs
something,
truck
right?
to the fair. It's not allowed, and so but because the site is like an embassy, is actually a piece of the U.S., we could theoretically bring it there under diplomatic conditions and display this, what you're afraid of, the biggest object of fear, this GMO corn. And I think ideas like that would be fantastic. Actually, in order to start a discussion, I think you need to provoke as much as the State Department will.
Yeah,
Well,
if we do,
that could happen.
it could happen.
It just so happens at 3 o'clock today, I was at the site of the 1939 World's Fair, and for 1 hour saw images on the screen of all the different buildings that were there, etc., etc., etc. I'd like to raise this question. We've come so far with food in the United States. Do we want to give the image of food trucks?
Well, as one part of the story, sure.
I think that you can't deny that they exist, and as we're going to have a fine dining restaurant with the greatest chefs of the country, I'm not sure I totally understand the question.
Well, I'd just like to leave that question with you.
Okay.
We've given the world the image of the hamburger, the M, now we're giving them food trucks.
Well, this is not Frosty Freeze or whatever these are not the food trucks of the 60s and the 50s. These are food trucks that are being, not your father's food truck, right?
2.0.
And they're not the good humor trucks, let's say, of
I
the time.
adore street food.
It's more than street food, actually.
This is
more
food
than
that
street food.
embraces a lot of the issues of sustainability. I mean,
Right.
to Jim's point, I think that if were you to go to some of the trucks that are parked on Fifth Avenue between 23rd and 14th Street, where our offices are, they're not selling, not selling your father's street food. They're selling organically raised, grass-fed beef tacos, 3 versions of organically grown vegetarian falafel from the Taim truck. I mean, it's a slightly different version. I actually think that it's a representation of the casualization of food that America has kind of given the world. When you go to restaurants now, there's a sense that feels American in a lot of restaurants. I mean, which we could argue is good and bad, depending on your perspective. But I don't think we've given given the world a cuisine. I think we've given them an approachability of food, a freedom of food that we see resonate in all of the great chefs in the world. I mean, there's a reason they want to come hang out and cook with their American buddies at WD-50, because there's a freedom that comes from that casualness that I think adds value, personally.
How do you bridge
So we can record.
Yes.
It's not that big a room, but
How
Scramble.
how do you bridge in a way it's almost a contradiction, because you want to represent something American, but in fact what seems to be American now is a profile of a very different immigrant profile, and that's reflected also in cuisine, and the boundaries between individual chefs and how they cook is no longer
Right.
hard-edged. And I mean, you have Pan-Asian influences, as you're mentioning, Wiley's influences. You have what I call the nomization of noma's kind of
Right.
prevailing
Foraging
influence
outside your door,
everywhere.
right.
How does what you ultimately show represent something that's American when it's not really
But what I
so
think-
discernible anymore?
Exactly that way is what I would say to you. That what the kimchi taco will be the Belgian waffle of the 2015
That's exactly
thing.
right.
No one has ever imagined such a thing could exist in Europe, and I think that is we're toying with this idea. Apparently, every country gets a day. So you have the U.S. National Day, where you sort of take over the pavilion, and what we've proposed doing for that day is creating
Take
a
over the whole fair.
The whole fair, right, the whole fair. What we've proposed doing for that day is creating a passport, a food passport for people to come pick up at the American Pavilion and go find every one of the communities represented by those 148 countries somewhere in America's culture and their food, because they're here. And we think we are almost unique in that proposition to some way, at least to the point that we celebrate it and you can find them in Queens. And so to us, that I think is going to be part of the 2.0, which is embracing the real globality of how we eat here, which I think we take for granted. I taught students for 10 years, 10 summers, I taught students in Florence, NYU master students in Florence, in a food and culture and the Mediterranean diet nutrition program for 4 weeks. And by day 6, they're like, where can we get anything that isn't Italian food? And we're like, well, but we're in Italy, where they eat Italian food every day, morning, noon, and night, mostly. And that's all they expect to eat. And so I think that is such an American food thing you just described that we hope to be able to present. The challenge, and the reason I think it's a challenge isn't so much because why is it American? The challenge is the visitors from around the world have to come wanting to consume it. Like when we talk about coffee or anything, most of the people, or a large group of the people will be Italians here, and they come with their own food predilections, and they don't eat certain things, and they're not going to be open to certain experiences. A friend of mine who is a great Italian food expert loves to see, she lives 6 months of the year in Italy, and she loves to see all these signs and she loves that Italians are great travelers, global travelers, Indian trekking, whatever, and all the signs in travel tourist agencies say, 41 days in India, cibo Italiano. So you eat Italian food when you're there, which is what they want to eat, even in India.
And
so
the French are worse.
Right. So the challenge is how do you make it and have them serve it? What the directors of Expo sort of laughed when we thought we would create a beard house experience and charge what we charge at the Beard House for an American restaurant, and they think they're going to pay that to come eat an American meal. You're crazy. No one is coming here for 200 euros to your restaurant, you Americans. So how do we fit that into, well, because you can go get a great Italian meal for $40, so you have to sort of fit what we want to do into what is possible to be done with the people who will be there. And that is the challenge of bringing American cuisine, I think, which is we think it's great, but they don't want to go to Starbucks. They'd rather go to the Italian cafe and get their macchiato the way they like it.
And for my architect colleague, I would say this building is a kind of perfect example of what America does to in this case, international style architecture. Sort of, it takes European architecture. An Austrian architect, Joseph Urban, comes here, builds European architecture. There is no building in Europe like this building, but it is the first international style building in New York, earlier than the Modern Museum, and so in 1931, then fills it with Orozco murals, and does an auditorium that predates, that presages Radio City. And it's an extraordinary thing that this is sort of in a way the most American building, the new school of social research, the kind of
new vision of America,
new vision of America.
Freedom.
It was built as rebellion against more established universities, and so it seems to me to be exactly an analog for what happens with food, and that's kind of what's so fantastic about it.
Yeah, would be sure.
Hi. How many brands do you have participating in the pavilion right now?
Brands as sponsors?
Yeah, sponsor brands.
All sponsors are not brands. I mean, right now I think we have 5, but we are hoping to have a small number, mostly because the process is cumbersome. Every organization or individual has to be vetted by the State Department. That vetting process is obtuse at best and timely at worst. And includes companies like Coke, who haven't quite passed yet. So I don't. Coke is not in the pavilion yet, but it's just like I think they're fine. I don't know what you're looking for, but I think they're fine. So we're trying to limit it, and also to be able to deliver it to people. There are 2 challenges. Obviously, the amount of money that we're trying a small group of very high donors, not necessarily food people, some lesser, and then we may go down just to build enthusiasm when we're closer to even a Kickstarter thing where you can sort of get a pin and contribute to the last hurdle of the experience, just to really feel like we're bringing America over there. But there are not going to be a lot of logos on this thing. By design, if we can avoid it.
And how do you get past the challenge of convincing, your exhibitors, I guess, to go over there for 6 months, to invest, to see this far in the, first of all, to see that far ahead, but yeah, to make this big investment for 6 months.
6 months, I forgot to say. The first one was, getting past the process, and then it's 6 months of activation, which is a very long time. But this is not a trade show the way that exhibitors come and put up. They're actually not allowed to put up commercials. We are building a story about American food that will be supported by a bunch of companies, and we'll work collaboratively and integrate with them. But there'll be no sort of person standing in a booth talking about, I don't know, this product or that product by design. It's not allowed. The pavilions are, a lot of the governing body has rules for the pavilions. They have to be open the entire time. They're free of charge. You can't charge to enter them. The country pavilions, the corporate pavilions are slightly different. And they pay rent and buy real estate the way you would at anything. These are given. There's lots of rules about how they're given and how they can be used and how you can build on them and stuff like that. They're considered diplomatic territory, more or less. They come with some rules.
And some sponsors give value in kind, so that the photovoltaic roof glass panels, which are really both generating electricity, but also are called electrochromic. You can actually dial them from clear to black, so they provide shade. I mean, that's a technology that a company in Minnesota is developing. It's not our idea, but it's an idea that's kind of floating around. And the idea that they could demonstrate that is a demonstration of a kind of really interesting bit of technology. Or the timber that lines the boardwalk is, we hope, going to be the timber that was removed from the Coney Island boardwalk and recut, milled. And as I said to them, I said, well, we don't really want to buy it. We just want to borrow it. You can have it back when we're done. And so, there's sort of pieces of technology, pieces of iconography, So it isn't all about selling, it isn't all about selling widgets.
But isn't, but,
Illy, well, because Illy is the global coffee sponsor for the entire exhibit, the entire expo, and quite honestly, they laughed at the idea that Starbucks would serve coffee to these
Yeah,
people coming.
that's why.
I mean, quite honestly. And so Illy happens to be a longtime friend of the James Beard Foundation and people here, and we just thought, why are we going to try to give them something they don't want, which is not going to serve anyone well,
And it was
quite
preemptive
honestly.
on the part of Illy. I mean, it was
Yeah, they
preemptive
were
to-
very
to-
aggressive
yeah.
and very supportive, and they have a very close relationship with Coca-Cola and fancy themselves
Right.
as big an American company as Italy. So it's an interesting dance. Barilla, we were entertaining Barilla at one point, and may still, which has the largest pasta factory in the world in Iowa, not in Italy. It is the third or fourth largest food company in the world, privately owned. The politics and the family dynamics have put that where it needs to be. But it's like, well, why would that be there? They actually sell more pasta here than they do in Italy. So the world is very different from 1906
Yeah.
or 1851. Although you could argue, right, that they actually led to this. Like those sorts of
Yeah, exactly.
interactions have created the world we're in, where capital moves freely for all good and bad across borders. One more question, I guess, and then we'll call it a night.
I missed the beginning of part of the lecture, but I don't know if you mentioned if you're going to tie this in with the American public, like how we can interact, even though maybe we won't go to Milan. But if we can have a screen of all the different food porn pictures that people post or whatever, I was wondering what you guys are planning to do with foodies here.
Yeah, doing stuff here is really important for us. I think it's actually a little bit new from the State Department's perspective. I mean, we feel a responsibility, if we're going to raise all this money from American companies, to make these issues resonate here in America. It's great. The people will come to Milan regardless, but if we can do something here, so it's a very I think, important question. There are a couple of things we intend to do. One is to gather a big sort of virtual community of people interested, and the food truck experience will travel around to different cities in the fall and in the beginning of next year, and kind of allow people to tell their stories, a sort of StoryCorps for food in some way, also to begin to sign up, to follow, to communicate with us. We're going to create a design innovation challenge, which will begin at South by Southwest in March, and bring a community of hackers and innovators and social responsibility folks together throughout the whole expo. It'll sort of terminate at the end of the fair. And engage people in that conversation. And then also the quote-unquote thought leadership piece, which is really about picking the topics that are part of food security, that are part of sort of public health issues, and finding touch points at the Beard Foundation events, at all sorts of things around the country. So it's a matrix, I would say, and hopefully, I mean, I think that this is the time to do this. There are so many people interested and engaged in food system related issues, whether it's an urban farm in Detroit or it's, the Aspen Institute's food sustainability thought leader things, and trying to find a way for everyone to jump in is something we hope to do. Whether or not we'll be successful, I'll tell you in November of 2015. Anyway, thank you so much
Thanks.
for coming and
Thanks
for your
for coming.
attention and your questions.
Most Americans don't know about it.